meaning that the government will upgrade small-scale labor-intensive industry through the investment of more capital and extension of more protection, which means the government could continue maintain the multiple foreign exchange rate. But reformers led by Yin Zhongrong argued an export orientation for Taiwan, such a shallow dish economy. So they asked for developing large-scale labor-intensive manufacturing firms to compete in the international market. But to compete in the international market, which means Taiwan's economy had to integrate with international economy, foreign exchange rate is a serious obstacle. So the first thing to do is to reform the foreign exchange rate. So debate continued and gained heated. But this time, the debate were mainly held among Kuomintang Party within the government. Conservatives led by Xu Boyuan, T.Y. Xu, who was then financial minister and chairman of Foreign Exchange and Trade Commission. Xu Boyuan argued that Taiwan's industry had always depended on processing of agricultural products and was still unable to compete in international markets. And Xu Boyuan argued that they still need state protection and assistance. And any premature opening of market, Xu Boyuan warned, would expose Taiwan's manufacturing industry by exposing them to cheap import and leaving export unable to compete in the world market. And the consequences would be domestic inflation and loss of government revenue, which would undermine public confidence and might even destroy Taiwan's economy. But reformers led by Yin Zhongrong disagreed with Xu Boyuan. Yin Zhongrong argued that Taiwan economy was facing new challenges and only remedy was liberalization, privatization, liberalization, and reforms. And Taiwan had to break out of this structure. Yin Zhongrong stressed that domestic and global markets must be integrated by expand market demand for Taiwan's enterprises to modernize and improve their competitiveness. And Yin Zhongrong asked for rapid liberalization of foreign trade. But top leaders like Chen Cheng and Chiang Kai-shek, who knew very little about economics, they really didn't know what to do. They really didn't know which part was correct. So Chiang Kai-shek setting up a foreign exchange and trade research team to ask them to debate within the door, closed door and debate. The team with only 4 members. Chen Cheng was convener of the team. Premier Yu and Finance Minister Xu and Jiang Biao, the Conservatives, Minister of Economic Affairs, and Yin Zhongrong, who was then Economic Stability Board Secretary General. So they argued every day about which way Taiwan should go. Chen Cheng, without understanding what they were arguing about. So Chen Cheng was usually just sitting there, idling, impatiently watching, listening to their argument. And then after an hour or so, Chen Cheng asked, "Enough? Enough? Then that's end today. Then we'll argue tomorrow again." After a whole month of debate. But you can see Yin Zhongrong was very lonely because Premier Yu, Minister Xu, and Minister Jiang, they were conservatives. They were state enterprise supporters. Yin Zhongrong was very lonely. 1 month after, when C.K. Yan Jiagai returned from America, Chen Cheng was very glad. Chen Cheng invited Yan Jiagai to join the committee, and Chen Cheng said to Yan Jiagai, "Thank God that you returned, and you must join our committee," because he did the debate, and which I really don't know. I cannot make a decision. I really don't know which side was correct. So you must help me with this. But Yan Jiagai, who always appreciated Yin Zhongrong's talent And Yan Jiagan was also one of the very few Kuomintang top leaders who changed their understanding of solving economic problems. So Yan Jiagan certainly endorsed Yin Zhongrong's policy, and using his skillful communication and political skills, Yan Jiagan soon successfully persuaded Chen Chen to support Yin Zhongrong's policy. So on the last meeting of the research meeting, Chen Chen told Premier Xu, Finance Minister Xu, saying, well, Minister Xu, now our research group has decided to adopt Mr. Ying's policy. But you, as Minister of Finance, I have a question. Could Ministry of Finance support such a policy? And Xu Boyuan, Minister Xu, said to Chen Chen, as well as to Premier Yu Hongjun, saying that I have fully expressed my position, and you know I disagree with such a premature reform. So right now, I'm resigning my position as Minister of Finance as well as Chairman of Foreign Exchange Rate Commission. And so on March 19, 1958, Foreign Exchange and Trade Reform launched. Economics, Chinese economics and Western economics all agreed this is the most aggressive economic reform for Kuomintang, for nationalist government, who had never had, and ever since they moved to 1949. It was most aggressive, unfortunately also the only one, the only dynamic, creative reform that Kuomintang government had never had for economic reform. The new reform, let's look at the new legislatures. It's very simple. 3 points. 1, the reform transformed multiple exchange rates into dual exchange rates. 2, dual exchange rate. And the reform, the government boldly, bravely devalued the overvalued purchase price of Xin Taibi, Taiwan dollar, from NT 24.58 to NT 40 per US dollar. You know, I've been doing this research for more than 10 years. Even now, I myself still could not understand how those people could be so brave, so bold as to devaluate the exchange rate from 24 to 40. You know, even a minor 1 prime rate, government would be very cautious, and the market would be very sensitive and cautious to a change to even 1 prime rate. And the third point is government's policy from now on was to emphasize the encouragement of export rather than the restriction of imports. Now the floodgates were opened. But with the success of the reform, Yin Zhongrong did one thing that surprised most of his fellows. Yin Zhongrong published an article at Zhongyang Ribao, Central Daily News, right after reform. He said, it is an incomplete revolution which continued to place too many restrictions on import and too much protections on foreign trade sectors. Yin Zhongrong urged for more reforms. And one interesting story, when Chen Chen appointed Yin Zhongrong, replaced Yin Zhongrong as chairman of Foreign Exchange Commission to replace Minister Xu, and in his appointment session at the Legislative Yuan, the legislative members in that session, they questioned Yin Zhongrong, trying to see whether he was qualified for that position, for chairman of the Foreign Exchange and the Trade Control Commission. And Yin Zhongrong said one sentence which surprised, shocked all the members. He said, my mission at FETCC is to terminate this institution. By so, Yin Zhongrong meant that he hoped the government would need more reform, no more restrictions. Government with no more restrictions. So there will be no further foreign trade controls. So 他说，我到外贸会的唯一的责任就是消灭这个机构。It's very interesting, and also surprisingly, the legislative yuan approved his appointment. After 1959, U.S. changed their foreign aid policy. So U.S. Aid Commission warned nationalist government that U.S. aid to Taiwan will be reduced and eventually will terminate. And they pressed Taiwan to improve Taiwan's business environment to attract more foreign investment. And Taiwan had no choice but to face up the challenge. Taiwan has to do within a couple of years to be independent from American aid. And after several rounds of negotiations, debates, etc., etc., and finally, in 1959 and 1960, 尹仲荣、严家淦, they still worry that the problem that still too many laws and regulations concerning economic and financial affairs. So, Yin Zhongrong, he was then CUSA, Committee of U.S. Aid. He was then a vice chairman of CUSA. He urged a package of reforms that would mandate all the laws and regulations be embodied in a single law. And after hundreds of arguments, publications, debates, finally in 1960, the government and legislative yuan approved the statute for encouraging investment. Don't be misled by the title of this statute. It's actually a whole package of reform. So the government committed a fiscal, monetary, and foreign exchange reform and changes in economic strategy, plus tax exemption and private enterprises' right to buy land. And the government encouraged firms to invest and expand productive capacity and output. Then, with the passing of statute for encouraging investment, the government committed to encourage private enterprises. And private enterprises become the engine of economic growth for Taiwan's economic future. Yin Zhongrong, in early 1962, he published an article again at Central Daily News. He said the title was 10年来经济发展的检讨与展望, examine Taiwan's economic development in the past 10 years and the future outlook. Yin Zhongrong said, he criticized himself. He said, my biggest mistake in the past 10 years of economic development is that there has not been a comprehensive political, social, economic reform. Economic and financial change won't sustain a successful economic reform. A real economic reform would only be possible when there is also comprehensive political, social, cultural reform, which he means institutional change that he was urging for. But unfortunately, you all know that Taiwan economy grew up fast, and in the past 20, 30 years, Taiwan enjoyed the fame of productive market economy. But unfortunately, Yin Zhongrong died on January 24, 1963, at the age of 59, without a chance to see the fruits of his reforms. Let me conclude, trying to conclude and what I have been sharing with you, that we saw a small group of